20 experts failed, but a black janitor fixed it in 5 minutes. The Millionaire CEO's reaction shocked everyone. Welcome to Beyond Color Stories. And I'm your storyteller, James. Tonight, you're not just watching a story. You're stepping into the final heartbeat of a love that changed everything. For 25 years, they built an empire from nothing but courage and love. She rose from a janitor's closet. He shattered his walls just to walk beside her. But now, as the world watches their legacy on the biggest stage, Brian leans in and whispers one final truth to Emily. I'd crash this whole system again, just to meet you one more time. Let me ask you this. Would you start your entire life over just to find your soulmate again? Grab your heart. You'll need it. Because this chapter is more than an ending. It's a forever. Let's begin. Star. The morning started like any other at Caldwell Innovations, a billion-dollar tech empire nestled in the glass and steel heart of the city. The sky above was a cloudless blue, but inside the 37th floor it felt like a storm was brewing. Sleek corridors buzzed with the soft clicks of designer shoes and the occasional ping of urgent emails. But something was off. Subtly, then suddenly. It began with a flicker. Monitors glitched. Automated lights dimmed for a moment, flickered again, and then returned to full brightness. Everyone ignored it, thinking it was just a brief surge, until everything stopped. At exactly 9:13 a.m., the mainframe that powered Caldwell Innovations' global infrastructure, security, data processing, client portals, and sensitive analytics crashed without warning. Screens across departments went black, phones lost connection. The hum of the servers ceased with a mechanical sigh, and a wave of cold silence fell like a veil over the entire building. Then the panic set in. The elite engineering team, 20 of the highest-paid, most experienced tech experts in the country, scrambled into the Situation Room. The walls of the control center lit up with flashing emergency alerts, red diagnostics spilling across the screens, unreadable and wild. Each member of the team had been handpicked by Mr. Brian Caldwell himself, the notoriously perfectionist CEO who had built the company from the ground up. And now these experts were failing in real time, their faces growing paler by the minute. In a room usually filled with confident chatter and caffeine-fueled bravado, now only tense breathing and the tap-tap-tap of frantic keystrokes could be heard. Sweat-dotted brows. Ties were loosened. 2 engineers argued about protocol while another attempted to reboot the servers manually. "Try port 1182, one barked. "We did that already. It's not responding," came the reply. Panic layered over panic. Everyone feared the same thing, Brian's fury. And in the middle of all this chaos, quietly and invisibly, moved a woman no one paid attention to. Emily, the janitor. With her mop bucket gliding beside her, she moved through the chaos like she belonged to a different dimension. Her brown skin glistened softly under the lights, framed by stunning natural beauty and the confidence of someone who had always known she was made for more, even if the world hadn't figured it out yet. Her uniform was simple, blue and pressed. Her long dark lashes didn't flinch as alarms rang in the background. Her eyes, warm and intelligent, scanned her surroundings with quiet observation. Emily had worked at Caldwell Innovations for 2 years. Assigned to the night shift originally, she had requested mornings simply so she could watch the people in this world, the people who lived in data and dominance. She loved technology, but more than that, she loved understanding it, unknown to those. Around her, she had built software in her tiny apartment. She'd read systems architecture textbooks cover to cover like they were poetry. She didn't have a degree, but she had something better. A mind that refused to sleep, a brain that decoded problems for fun, and a memory like a living processor. And now, as Emily swept the corner of the very floor where 20 engineers stood paralyzed, her ears caught fragments of code, panicked jargon, and desperation. She didn't need the full picture. She only needed a glimpse. She looked up slowly, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear as one of the side monitors flashed an error message. She didn't blink. Her heart jumped, not in fear but in focus. That line of code, she recognized it. It wasn't a random crash. It was a loop error deep within the company's security gateway, one that caused a cascading failure due to a system-wide redundancy overload. Most people would have missed it. But Emily, she'd seen it once before, on a forum thread she'd read at 2 a.m. over ramen and jazz music. No one was watching her. The room was too consumed. Quietly, Emily parked her mop, stepped closer, and glanced around. There was an unused backup terminal near the far wall. She walked to it, heart steady, fingers trembling not from nerves but from energy. She sat, logged in with a limited Janitor account. She bypassed it. She didn't have permission, but she didn't need it. Lines of code danced before her. With every keystroke, her mind fired faster. She navigated through 5 layers of access like she was born in this system. Then she did what no one else had done. She stopped trying to reboot it. She redirected the root cycle, paused the feedback loop, and killed a phantom protocol no one knew was even running. The mainframe gave a soft beep, then another, and then, after 5 full minutes that felt like 5 lifetimes to everyone in the room, every screen blinked back to life. Emails reconnected, data restored, systems stabilized. Across the building, a sigh of relief moved like wind. The engineers froze, glancing around. "Who?" someone whispered. The head of IT looked at his screen, confused. Who did that? Only then did they notice Emily, still seated, her fingers pausing over the keys. She stood slowly, aware now that dozens of eyes were on her. A silence louder than chaos spread across the room. Emily didn't say a word. She picked up her mop and walked out. On the top floor, a glass office overlooked the chaos. Mr. Brian Caldwell stood in his black tailored suit, eyes glued to the security footage. He had watched it all, the panic, the failure, the arguments, the frozen experts. And then he had seen her. He watched the janitor walk in calm, sit like she belonged, and do what none of his paid team could. Brian was a man who valued loyalty, power, and excellence. And in that moment he saw something he hadn't expected. A woman who didn't just think outside the box. She was the box, the code, and the solution. He hit a button on his desk phone. "Get me her name," he said quietly. "Right now." Downstairs, Emily stepped into the janitor's locker room and stared at herself in the mirror. She didn't smile. She didn't preen. She just stared at her reflection, took a slow breath, and whispered, "You did what you had to do." Because Emily had never needed praise. All she had ever needed was a chance. And for the first time in her life, she had taken one. Mr. Brian Caldwell stood motionless in his top-floor office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that reflected the skyline behind him and the wreckage below. His reflection stared back at him like a man caught between thunder and clarity, but his eyes were fixed solely on the paused security footage before him. Frame by frame, the surreal reality unfolded again in silence. Emily, that was her. The janitor. He had reviewed the camera angle 3 times already, and each time it unsettled him deeper, not because of what she did, fixing the system in 5 minutes flat, but how she did it, how she moved like someone invisible and undeniable at the same time, calm as if chaos had no dominion over her. His gaze, usually razor-sharp and emotionally sterile, softened in an unguarded blink as he watched her lean over that forgotten terminal, her fingers gliding over the keys with focused confidence, her shoulders perfectly still while 20 engineers unraveled behind her. He narrowed his eyes, watched how she stood afterward, not like someone seeking praise, but like someone used to walking away without it. How she simply resumed her place in the background, like a ghost no one thought to see. Brian had built Caldwell Innovations into a global powerhouse, with blood, precision, and an intolerance for mediocrity. And now, in the span of 5 minutes, a woman he didn't even know existed within his walls had outperformed the men and women he paid millions to protect his empire. He felt it not as a threat, but as something electric. Dangerous not because she was unpredictable, but because she was exactly what he valued most. Effective, extraordinary, and undiscovered, and that made her rare, very rare. His jaw clenched as he hit the intercom on his desk and told his assistant in a tone that brokered no delay, "I'm heading to floor 37. Hold all my calls." He didn't wait for a reply. The glass doors slid open, and he walked with a stride so exact that everyone in the hallway instinctively stepped aside. Elevator down, heart steady, mind racing, not with panic, but with something much harder to define, curiosity, admiration, maybe even awe, though he wouldn't have admitted that even to himself. The elevator chimed open to a corridor now quiet, the hum of restored systems a lullaby against the chaos that had gripped it just minutes before. Staff turned their heads, startled to see him, Mr. Brian Caldwell, descending from Olympus, in person. He ignored them. He scanned the room, but she was gone. One of the engineers, still stunned, gestured vaguely toward the janitor's wing with a whisper. Brian followed without hesitation. Past the server rooms, past the vending alcove, past the hallway no one ever cared about. He walked with purpose until he saw her. Emily stood beside her mop, pulling off her gloves, the look on her face unreadable. Neither proud nor shaken, simply finished, like someone who had closed a book and was already thinking about the next one. Her presence in that moment stole his breath in a way he didn't expect. She wasn't just beautiful, though she was, undeniably, with her smooth brown skin catching the fluorescent light like silk and her features striking in their stillness, but there was a depth to her posture, a gravity to her silence that no resume could have captured. She turned just slightly when she sensed him, but did not startle, did not panic, did not look confused. She knew who he was, and she did not bow. That, more than anything, made his throat tighten. He stopped just 3 feet from her, hands at his sides, heart strangely unsettled. He studied her face like a code he hadn't yet learned how to read, and for a moment he didn't speak. She waited, not with submission, but with the patience of someone who had no interest in forcing a moment. Finally, his voice broke the air, quiet and deliberate. "Who are you?" The question came not as an accusation, not as a dismissal, but like a genuine search for a truth that was long overdue. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize both power and pain, and her voice, soft but firm, answered without pause. Emily. Just her name, and yet it hung in the air like a secret finally spoken. Brian felt something shift beneath his skin at the way she said it, as if she knew that being seen for the first time could be a revolution in itself. He repeated the name in his mind like it meant more than just identification. It meant defiance, elegance, brilliance. Emily. It was a name he would not forget, not now, not ever. He took another step forward, scanning her once more, her calm, her command, the intelligence radiating just beneath her composed surface. He wanted to ask how she did it. He wanted to ask how someone like her ended up with a mop instead of a machine, a bucket instead of a badge. But he said nothing more, because something told him she wouldn't explain. Not here, not now, maybe not ever. She simply tilted her head slightly, waiting to see what he'd do next. And for the first time in years, Brian Caldwell didn't have a ready answer. He didn't walk away. He didn't scold. He didn't order. He just looked at her, stunned not by what she had fixed, but by who she had just become in his world. And it was in that exact moment, standing in a dim hallway beside a mop, and a woman who had just rewritten the script of his entire company, that Mr. Brian Caldwell felt the first spark of something he hadn't experienced in years. Not strategy, not control, but admiration, raw and real, for a mind and a mystery named Emily. Brian Caldwell stood still, frozen for just a moment longer than usual, as the faint echo of Emily's footsteps down the hall lingered in his mind like a whisper he couldn't ignore. His office, usually a sanctuary of cold steel and clean-cut efficiency, now felt oddly disrupted, not by chaos but by something gentler, unfamiliar, something alive. The moment her name left her lips downstairs, Emily, the syllables had branded themselves into his thoughts like an enigma waiting to be understood. So, when he pressed the intercom and summoned her to his office, it wasn't just to solve the mystery of the malfunctioning surveillance system. It was to understand the rare clarity in her eyes, the steady tone of someone who didn't flinch beneath the weight of powerful attention. Emily, still clutching her cleaning gloves, ascended the executive floor under the eyes of stunned employees frozen in their cubicles. Whispers followed her like a ghostly breeze. "She's just a janitor. How is she going to Brian Caldwell's office? Did she fix the server issue? Is this a joke?" But Emily didn't pause, didn't look around, didn't absorb their doubts. She had been seen by someone who mattered now, and somehow it steadied her steps like silent armor. She pushed open the frosted glass door, her reflection blending into the skyline behind Brian's floor-to-ceiling windows as he stood waiting, hands in his pockets, eyes shadowed but intent. "Close the door," he said quietly, and she obeyed, letting the latch click softly behind her. The room seemed colder now, not from temperature, but from the razor-sharp presence of its occupant. Brian didn't move for a moment. He simply stared at her, then slowly walked to his desk and leaned back against it. His head tilted slightly, as if studying a puzzle. "Sit," he gestured toward the leather chair opposite him, and Emily lowered herself onto the edge, her posture poised but respectful, not meek. He watched her carefully before speaking, his voice low and deliberate. "How did you fix it?" No preamble, no small talk, just the question he hadn't been able to shake since he watched her on the screen. Emily met his gaze, her back straightening just a bit. The loop wasn't just a glitch. It was a recursive firewall trigger caused by a misaligned proxy relay. Whoever designed it masked the origin in your backup chain instead of the main hub, so your IT team kept looking in the wrong place. Brian blinked once, slowly. His mouth parted, not in surprise, but in something rarer. Interest. Real interest. "You knew that just from watching the screens. I've seen that kind of corruption before," she said, folding her hands calmly in her lap. "I used to audit security systems before things changed." Her voice dropped slightly, not out of shame, but something closer to sorrow. Brian didn't interrupt. He sensed that if he pushed, she'd shut down. So instead, he leaned in slightly. "And what exactly changed?" Emily's lips parted, but then she shook her head gently. "That's not why I'm here. You asked about the fix. That's all I came to explain." Brian's brow furrowed. This wasn't evasion. It was dignity. She wasn't hiding, she was protecting something. "You reverse-engineered my network in minutes," he said slowly, almost to himself. "That system was built by top-level consultants. You did what they couldn't." Emily shrugged lightly. "Sometimes the problem isn't the system. It's the people who built it. They overcomplicate things to justify the price tag. I just listened to the patterns." He tilted his head again. "You talk like someone who's been in boardrooms. But you're mopping my floors. Why?" The question hung like a weight in the room, not cruel, just brutally honest. Emily smiled faintly, almost sadly. Because sometimes life teaches you more than a job title, and because starting over is humbling. Her answer was gentle but carried iron underneath. Brian stood slowly, then walked around the desk and sat down, opening his laptop with a sharp click. The silence was thick as he tapped keys, eyes flicking to lines of code, logs, diagnostics. He wasn't doubting her. He was confirming what he already knew. When he closed the lid again, the quiet was almost reverent. "You saved me," he said. "Not just from a system crash. That loop wasn't accidental. It was sabotage. Someone was trying to take us offline, and they almost did." Emily's eyes darkened a little, but she didn't speak. Brian's voice lowered even more. "You exposed something even my executive board didn't catch. I need someone like that." He rose again and walked slowly to the window, his hands sliding into his pockets, his profile outlined against the sprawling city behind him. "From now on," he said, turning back to face her, "you don't mop floors." Emily blinked. "Excuse me?" "You work beside me, starting today." He didn't ask. He declared. Her jaw tightened. "I didn't do this for a reward." "Good," he said, stepping closer. "That's why I trust you, and I don't offer trust easily." She didn't respond right away, the weight of his words slowly settling in. Her heartbeat had quickened, not out of fear, but out of the sheer gravity of what had just happened. She stood. "What exactly would this new position be?" she asked carefully. "You'll help me fix what's broken," Brian replied. "Not just in the system, but in this company. Maybe even in me." It was the closest thing to vulnerability she'd ever seen from a man like him. "Is that a job description?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Brian's lips curved, just a little, the faintest smile. "That's a mission, and I think you're the only one who can handle it." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was electric, not heavy. Emily took a deep breath. "Then I accept, but on one condition." Brian nodded. "Name it." "I want honesty, no secrets. If I'm going to walk into fire for you, I need to know where it burns." Brian's smile faded into something more serious, respectful. "Then let's begin," he said. He walked to the door, opened it, and gestured for her to step outside. The eyes of the staff outside widened in disbelief as Brian walked behind her, then turned to his assistant. "Clear her schedule. She's no longer janitorial staff. She's reporting to me directly." "Sir," the assistant stammered. "You heard me." Emily didn't look back at the whispers that exploded around her this time. She walked forward, head high, feeling something she hadn't in years. Possibility. Not just a new position, not just a new life, but the spark of something unspoken that had passed between her and the man who had summoned her not just to question, but to see her. And in his eyes she had found not a CEO, not a boss, but something more dangerous. Someone curious, someone waking up, someone who, for the first time in years, had smiled. As the door closed behind Emily and she returned to her new workspace, an office just outside Brian Caldwell's glass sanctuary, the building seemed to shift subtly around her. The same employees who once whispered in corners now greeted her with reluctant awe or uneasy respect. But Emily didn't bask in attention. She focused, precise and unwavering, as if she knew the spotlight was fragile, easily snuffed out by a single mistake. In the weeks that followed her appointment, her mind moved through the company's tangled frameworks like lightning. Every day she uncovered inefficiencies in the logistics system, rebuilt portions of the digital infrastructure with surgical precision, and proposed structural changes that made even the department heads scramble to catch up. Memos she drafted were copied and studied by analysts. Security protocols she designed tightened leak points no one else had even identified. She didn't just solve problems, She predicted them. Executives who once scoffed at the idea of a janitor-turned-strategist now sat in meetings wide-eyed, watching her walk circles around teams of experts. And through it all, Brian Caldwell watched her. Not passively, not politely, but with a quiet, consuming attentiveness that went far beyond professional curiosity. At first, he justified it internally. He needed to understand her thought process, he told himself. He was trying to learn how she processed complexity with such clarity. But soon it became harder to lie to himself, especially during late evenings when the office grew quiet, and it was only the two of them left in the glow of overlapping screens. Emily had a way of carrying herself that disarmed him, not with flirtation or force, but with a kind of effortless grace, a calm presence that refused to shrink under pressure. She challenged him. She didn't nod politely when she disagreed. She argued logically, boldly, always with respect, but never with fear. She made him re-examine choices he'd made without question for years, and she did it with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to offer. Brian, who had built walls as high as the skyline outside his window, found himself cracking open in small, strange ways. He started looking forward to the sound of her footsteps approaching. He noticed how her lips pursed when she read something irritating. He memorized the cadence of her laughter when something caught her off guard, rare but unforgettable. Emily noticed things too. She noticed how Brian always adjusted his watch when he was about to disagree with someone, how his expression turned unreadable when he was hiding doubt, how he sometimes lingered too long at her door after a meeting ended, as if words were hanging in his throat that he never allowed to fall. She saw him not just as a CEO, but as a man worn down by years of isolation behind power, a man used to commanding, not connecting. And yet, he listened to her, not out of obligation, but out of need. And somewhere between the late-night reports and strategy sessions, the space between them started to hum with something unspoken. One particular evening, the city outside lay beneath a velvet sky, lights twinkling across glass towers as the clock struck well past midnight. Most of the building was dark, but Brian's office glowed with warm amber light. Emily sat on the couch, cross-referencing financials and vendor reports on her tablet, while Brian leaned over her from behind, watching the screen, his sleeves rolled up, his tie long discarded. They'd been discussing supplier fraud, numbers, logistics, but the conversation had drifted. Brian asked her about a childhood memory she'd briefly mentioned the day before, and Emily surprised herself by answering. Her voice softened as she recalled the tiny planetarium her father used to take her to, and how it was the only place she ever felt close to the stars. Brian had said nothing for a while after that, then murmured, "You talk about the past like it's still breathing." "Isn't it?" she'd said softly, not looking up. He didn't answer, just watched her profile in the glow of the screen. And then it happened. A simple gesture, a finger, his, pointing toward a corner of the tablet to highlight a calculation error. Her hand already moving to the same place. Their fingers brushed, barely, but the contact sent a jolt through both of them, something raw, primal, immediate. Emily's eyes widened as she froze. Brian did too. Their fingers still touched, not gripping, not holding, just touching. But the electricity surged through their skin like a wildfire igniting in the silence. Neither moved for a breath, then two. The air between them thickened with tension, so sharp it could have shattered glass. And then, as if choreographed by instinct, they both pulled away at once. Not violently, just abruptly, like touching something too hot. Brian stepped back, fingers curling into his palm. Emily exhaled slowly, lowering the tablet. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, loaded. They didn't speak for a full minute. Only the soft hum of the air vent and the far-off sound of city traffic dared to interrupt it. Finally, Brian turned his back to her, walking toward the window with measured steps. "That supplier," he began, voice hoarse. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but composed. "We'll need to renegotiate the contract." She stood too, gathering her notes, eyes firmly on the screen, though her heart still raced like a drum in her chest. Brian nodded, still staring at the skyline. "Let's discuss it again tomorrow." "Early." Emily didn't respond, only nodded, then slowly walked to the door. But just as her hand touched the handle, she turned slightly, her voice soft but edged with meaning. "Sometimes sparks are just electricity," she said. "Nothing more." Brian turned his head, just enough to see her in the reflection of the glass. "And sometimes," he replied, "they burn because we don't let them." Their eyes met in that reflection, his tired, hers uncertain, but both aware of the line they'd just tiptoed toward, of the space between them that now pulsed with a truth neither wanted to name yet. She left without another word, and he stayed, staring at her fading reflection, wondering how long he could keep pretending that what had just passed between them was accidental. Because it wasn't. It was a beginning, one they weren't ready to claim but couldn't deny. Brian stood alone in his office for a long while after Emily left that night, the reflection of her still lingering on the window, even after her footsteps had faded from the corridor. The city lights stretched endlessly in front of him, but his thoughts refused to travel outward anymore. They remained tethered to the echo of her presence, the warmth of her voice, the fleeting but undeniable electricity that had surged between them just moments ago. He didn't know when he began tracing her in the silence, not just her movements, but her essence. The way she breathed through pressure, the subtle spark in her eyes when a problem excited her, the curve of her lips when she challenged him with questions no one else dared to ask. And though he told himself the line hadn't been crossed, deep down he knew the line had vanished entirely the moment their hands had touched. In the days that followed, neither of them spoke of that night, but everything between them changed, subtly, silently, like code rewritten beneath the surface of a system, unseen yet impossible to ignore. They still spoke strategy and forecasts and risk projections, but every word stretched a little longer, lingered a little more. Their conversations no longer ended when the data did. They carried on, sometimes with soft laughter, sometimes in thoughtful silences, as if the language between them was shifting from logic to something more fragile, more human. Emily began noticing how often Brian stood near her without needing to, how his eyes met hers across rooms, not with command, but with understanding. She noticed the way he remembered tiny details she had only mentioned once. Her favorite tea, the kind of chair that hurt her back, the scent of lavender she used to calm her nerves. She noticed how, in meetings, his fingers would lightly tap against his thumb when he was thinking, something she now did too, unconsciously, as if mirroring had become instinct. Brian, on the other hand, found himself looking forward to her presence with a hunger he couldn't intellectualize. The CEO in him tried to rationalize it. She was brilliant, efficient, necessary to the company's survival. But the man in him, the man he hadn't allowed himself to be in years, felt a different truth humming beneath the surface. He began to crave not just her input, but her gaze, her attention, her stillness when she sat beside him. He noticed the small tremor in her fingers when she was frustrated, and the way her breath caught whenever their arms brushed by accident. He began staying later at the office, claiming it was because of workload, but secretly hoping she would too. She often did, and every time she did, he found himself breathing a little easier. One such night unfolded gently. The office had emptied early, the lights dimmed down to low settings as Emily remained behind, working on integrating a new AI-powered analytics tool into their logistics system. She sat curled up in the leather chair across from Brian, tablet in hand, glasses perched lightly on her nose, her face a picture of focus and elegance. Brian sat across from her, his own screen forgotten as he watched her instead, the glow of her tablet casting faint halos around her cheekbones. "You know," he said suddenly, quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them like velvet, "you've done more for me in a month than anyone has in years." Emily looked up slowly, blinking as if returning from deep concentration. Her eyes searched his, and something in her chest clenched. "Brian," she whispered, but he didn't let her speak further. "Not just the company," he continued, voice lower now, more fragile. "Me. You've changed the way I think, the way I feel. You've made this place, my life, feel alive again. I thought I was numb, that I was built to be cold, that it was the only way to survive in this world. But you," he trailed off, eyes drifting to her lips for just a second too long. "You make me feel things I didn't think I was allowed to want." Emily's throat tightened, her heart beating so loud she was certain he could hear it. She stood slowly, tablet forgotten on the coffee table, and took a tentative step toward him. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't look away. "Then stop holding back," she said softly, and the room went silent. Brian rose to his feet, his expression unreadable for a moment, but not unfeeling. He stepped toward her, one slow pace, then another, until there was only inches of space between them. He reached out, almost hesitantly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and his touch was so gentle it felt like a promise. Emily tilted her face slightly into his palm, her eyes fluttering shut, and in that shared breath, the air thickened, dense with everything unspoken between them. And then he kissed her, not with hunger, not with desperation, but with reverence. It was a kiss that spoke of weeks of silent longing, of sleepless nights and stolen glances, of restrained emotions now unraveling with unbearable tenderness. His lips moved slowly against hers, as if trying to memorize the shape of her heart through the connection. Emily responded with equal depth, her hands resting gently on his chest, not pulling, just being present, being held, being allowed to love. When they pulled away, it was not because the moment had ended, but because it had fulfilled something quiet and essential between them. Their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling, hearts thudding in tandem. Brian smiled softly, for once unguarded. "I don't know what this means," he admitted, "but I know it's real." Emily nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It's real," she echoed. "And maybe we don't need to name it yet. We just need to feel it." They sat down again, side by side this time, her head on his shoulder, his hand finding hers without hesitation. No more hiding. No more pretending it was just code and strategy. They had crossed into something sacred, a space where logic couldn't explain what had bloomed between them, and neither of them wanted to turn back. The quiet rhythm of Emily's breathing against Brian's shoulder that night became something he would never forget, not because it was grand or dramatic, but because it was real, grounding, pure. The next morning he arrived at the office earlier than usual, but Emily was already there, as if her soul had long synced with the heart of the company she now helped run in all but title. She didn't mention the kiss, and neither did he. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need words to validate it. Something between them had shifted permanently. But beyond the private affection, beyond the magnetic gravity that now existed in every glance between them, something far larger stirred inside Brian. Clarity. For the first time in his life, he saw that leadership was not just about intellect or control, but about courage. And courage, he realized, meant elevating those who dared to challenge you, to complete you, to stand beside you, not behind you. That thought stayed with him like a thread pulling through every task, every meeting, every decision. But the world around them had begun to buzz differently now. Whispers started snaking through hallways. Emily's sudden rise, her closeness to Brian, the undeniable chemistry between them. It stirred gossip like smoke in an old chimney. "She's just a janitor," someone muttered near the water cooler. "This is nepotism in disguise," another executive whispered. "She's got him wrapped around her finger," someone else said under their breath during a strategy briefing. But none of it mattered to Brian. Not anymore. He had built this empire on innovation, and there was nothing more revolutionary than acknowledging genius where no one else dared to see it. So, on a Monday morning, beneath the glass skylight of the Caldwell Innovations boardroom, with 12 senior executives seated before him, he stood tall at the head of the long table, his expression unreadable, but his intent blazing in his eyes. Emily stood at his right, unaware of what was about to unfold. Brian cleared his throat and every conversation silenced. "I have an announcement," he said firmly, his gaze scanning every face in the room. "Effective immediately, Caldwell Innovations will operate under a dual leadership structure." A few raised brows, others shifted uncomfortably. "I am naming Emily Carter," he continued without pause, "as co-chief executive officer." The room erupted, not into applause, but into shocked, stunned gasps. Papers rustled, chairs creaked. "What?" someone murmured. "She's not. She doesn't have the pedigree," one executive muttered too loudly. But Brian's voice rose with sharp command. "She has something better: vision, courage, intellect that has already restructured 3 core departments in under 6 weeks. She discovered sabotage in our security system. She rebuilt our logistics AI and increased our quarterly forecast margin by 18%. She has done more for this company than anyone in this room, including me." He turned slowly, eyes landing on each of them. "This is not favoritism. This is merit. And this company will either rise on talent or fall under ego." Emily stood frozen, eyes wide, lips parted in disbelief. She had known she was making an impact, but this was beyond imagination. The murmurs didn't stop entirely, but no one dared challenge him outright. His presence was too commanding, too final. Brian turned to her then, something softening in his expression as he said, "You've already been leading with me." It's time the title matched the truth. Emily's throat tightened, tears blurring her vision as she nodded slowly. But that wasn't the only moment Brian had planned for the day. After the board meeting ended, and after the congratulatory messages, some sincere, many forced, filtered into her inbox, Brian asked her to meet him in his private rooftop garden. The place was rare in the city, quiet, blooming with jasmine and hydrangeas, a space he'd never shared with anyone else. As she stepped out into the open sky, the breeze lifting the curls near her neck, she found him already waiting. He wasn't in a suit anymore, just a navy shirt rolled to his elbows and slacks, casual but undeniably elegant. Emily approached, uncertain why her heart had started to beat like thunder. Brian turned as she neared, and without preamble, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Emily froze. Her breath hitched. "Brian." He didn't wait. "You changed my life," he said simply, voice rough but steady. "You didn't just help this company, you helped me. You saw me, the man behind the power. You didn't fear me. You challenged me. You woke me up." He opened the box, revealing a ring so stunning it caught the light like morning dew. Simple, elegant, nothing ostentatious, but unmistakably full of meaning. "Be mine," he said, stepping forward. "In life, in business, in everything. Not because I need you, because I choose you, every day." Without hesitation, Emily's hands flew to her mouth as the tears began to fall freely, not from shock, but from the overwhelming sense of coming full circle, from janitor to executive, from silence to strength, from overlooked to irreplaceable. She reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as they grazed his. "Yes," she whispered through tears. "Yes, Brian. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger gently, reverently, as if sealing a covenant written in code, trust, and love. She threw her arms around him as he pulled her close, and for a moment the city disappeared. There were no skyscrapers, no rumors, no past. Only two souls who had found each other against every odd, in a world that had tried to keep them apart. When they finally pulled apart, Brian kissed her forehead softly. "We build now," he said, "not just empires, but a life." Emily nodded, smiling through the tears. "You changed mine, Brian," she whispered, "but I'll change yours too." As the echo of Emily's whisper, "But I'll change yours too," lingered between them on that rooftop where the scent of jasmine floated like a silent witness. Brian held her tighter, not out of possession, but out of reverence, as if he was afraid she might vanish if he didn't feel her heartbeat against his. But she didn't vanish. She stood there as steady as the city beneath them, her ring catching the fading sun, her soul wide open to a new life they were about to build, not from titles, not from legacy, but from truth, from fire, from a love neither of them ever expected. From that moment on, everything changed, quietly at first, like a breeze slipping through a locked window, but then undeniably, like sunrise flooding a cold room. The announcement of their engagement went public the same week Emily was named co-CEO, and though reactions were mixed across social circles, media boards, and corporate gossip pages, the two of them moved forward with unshakable calm. They didn't justify. They didn't explain. Because they didn't have to. The evidence was in every strategic decision they made, every profit margin that soared, every department that flourished under their joint vision. Emily, now not just a partner in name but in purpose, transformed the heart of Caldwell Innovations from a steel-structured empire into a pulsing organism of innovation. She introduced empathy-driven AI, green energy tech labs, global philanthropic collaborations, all while maintaining a grace that disarmed skeptics and galvanized believers. Brian stood beside her, not as a shield, but as a complement, his once icy demeanor now softened by her presence, his leadership more collaborative, his voice less sharp, but more powerful. He began to smile more, to listen deeper, to look out the window not for answers, but simply to feel the world she'd taught him to notice. Then came the wedding. It wasn't a spectacle of power or wealth. There were no roaring crowds or diamond-encrusted ballrooms. Instead, it was held on the same rooftop garden where he proposed, now transformed into a haven of white peonies, candles, and handwritten notes hanging from twine, a collection of their shared moments, scribbled memories only they understood. Emily wore a gown made of ivory silk, delicate and fluid, the kind of dress that didn't overpower her, it honored her. Her hair was gathered loosely at her nape, curls falling like whispers down her back, and in her hands she held not a bouquet of rare imported flowers, but wild blooms they had picked themselves on a quiet drive the weekend before. As she walked toward him, bare feet on a path of rose petals, laid out by friends who believed in love more than protocol, Brian's heart didn't race. It expanded. He couldn't breathe for a moment, not because he was nervous, but because she was beyond beautiful. She was whole, and in that moment he saw every version of her, the woman who mopped floors with quiet pride, the genius who rebuilt his crumbling empire with steady hands, the soul who kissed him not out of passion, but out of peace. His voice cracked as she reached him. He took her hands and whispered, "You're not my dream, Emily. You're my miracle." She blinked through tears and smiled, radiant with the quiet joy of a woman who had been seen, chosen, and celebrated, not for what she could give, but for who she was. The vows were personal, handwritten, trembling in the air between them, like violin notes. When they kissed, it was slow and still. No fireworks, no applause, just silence and tears and the warmth of two lives finally sealed together in front of the very skyline that once separated them. After the ceremony, they didn't fly to Paris or rent a villa on the Amalfi Coast. They returned to the home they had begun to build in secret, a loft apartment on the top floor of an old library turned living space, filled with books, plants, and laughter. The kitchen had mismatched chairs, the floors creaked, the walls had notes scribbled in chalk from late-night brainstorms, and it was perfect. Emily cooked barefoot while Brian cut vegetables like a man trying to learn gentleness through routine. They danced in the living room with coffee mugs in hand. They fell asleep reading next to each other, her head on his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist, breathing in unison. Sometimes they argued, not about business, but about where to place the new lamp or what to order for dinner. But the fights ended in laughter, in apologies spoken against foreheads, in kisses that tasted like understanding. And through it all, the empire they built outside those walls continued to thrive. Caldwell Innovations didn't just rise, it redefined its industry. Emily's Code of Compassion became a global framework for ethically driven AI. Brian launched a mentorship initiative for underprivileged youth, inspired by Emily's own journey. Together, they didn't just build wealth, they built wonder. And yet, behind closed doors, they remained deeply human. He kissed her shoulder when she worked late. She brought him his favorite black coffee when meetings drained him. They shared playlists, journaled together, celebrated small victories like kids discovering magic. One night, as rain tapped softly against the glass, and they sat curled on their sofa, Brian looked at her, not as co-CEO, not as the woman who saved his company, but as the woman who saved his heart. And he whispered, "I don't know how I ever breathed before you." Emily smiled, placed her palm over his heart, and said, "That's because you weren't living, Brian. You were surviving. But now, we're alive. And we're building something that no merger, no money, no boardroom can measure." And she was right. Their empire wasn't just built on stock or systems. It was built on laughter echoing through the halls, on shared silence in the middle of long nights, on eyes that met across busy rooms and still softened every time. It was built on two souls who had once stood at opposite ends of the world, one with a mop, one with a kingdom, and met in the middle not by luck, but by destiny. The warmth of that night still lingered in their home the following morning, where empty coffee mugs sat forgotten on the windowsill and notes from their latest shared vision, an innovation hub for underrepresented tech minds, were still spread across the floor, scribbled in every corner like silent confessions of brilliance and hope. But while love was thriving in their private world, the outside wasn't always so gracious. The world rarely applauded those who rose from dust to shine, especially not when they were women, and especially not when they carried the weight of once being invisible. It began with a headline, small, almost forgettable, tucked into the sidebar of a finance column, yet it punched with enough venom to ignite a blaze. From mop to merger, the janitor wife and her billionaire king. Emily saw it over breakfast, the article sent anonymously to her inbox without a subject line. She read it slowly, eyes scanning the words not with surprise, but with the calm ache of someone who had always known that history liked its heroines polished, not powerful. The article dripped with backhanded praise and condescending admiration, questioning her qualifications, spinning her brilliance into a Cinderella story painted with doubt, and reducing her impact to that of someone who had simply married well. But before she could even form a reaction, Brian had seen it too. And while Emily's pain was silent, Brian's fury was immediate and ice-sharp. He didn't call their publicist. He didn't prepare a PR draft. He called an all-hands press conference the same day. When the reporters gathered in the glass atrium of Caldwell Innovations, their murmurs bounced off marble and echoed with the glee of anticipated scandal. But when Brian stepped up to the podium, dressed not in his usual cold CEO armor but in a simple shirt and blazer, his eyes held fire. "Before you begin," he said, voice calm but cutting, "let me make one thing absolutely clear. The woman you all now call the janitor wife is not a fairy tale. She is not a headline. She is the architect of this company's survival. She didn't marry into power, she rebuilt it. When our systems were on the brink of collapse, she saw solutions no one else did. When we faced corporate decay, she restored integrity. She has brought global partnerships, innovated AI solutions, and designed human-first frameworks that have redefined how this company moves. If anything," he added, his voice lowering, "I married up. And if you can't see that, it's not her limitations you're exposing. It's your own." The silence that followed was absolute. No flashes, no follow-ups, just stunned stares and the sound of truth reclaiming its power. Emily watched from the side, her heart thudding, not just for the words, but for the clarity in his eyes as he said them. That night, they didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. But she leaned into his embrace with a softness that said, "Thank you," and he kissed the top of her head with a reverence that whispered always. But the challenges didn't end with headlines. Jealousy has sharp teeth, and inside the boardroom, not everyone was thrilled with the rise of a woman who threatened comfort with competence. One member, Marcus Lane, a man polished in charm but corroded by ego, began sowing dissent subtly. It started with small resistance, questioning her projections in meetings, undermining her budget proposals with bureaucratic delays, and leaking confidential fragments of her strategic plans to external consultants. Emily sensed it early, not because of paranoia, but because she understood the language of sabotage all too well. But rather than confront with fury, she responded with brilliance. She quietly tracked every move, compiling evidence, aligning timestamps, tracing leaked data not to its destination, but to its origin. And then, with the poise of a queen who never needed to raise her voice, she presented her findings during a quarterly strategy meeting. The screen lit up with a digital trail so clean, so irrefutable, that even Marcus's smirk vanished into silence. "I believe integrity is the most profitable asset," she said calmly as the room shifted uncomfortably. "Let's make sure we invest in it." Marcus resigned by morning, and the board didn't just respect her after that, they revered her. That evening, after the city lights had blurred into soft halos beyond their loft's tall windows, Brian found her curled up on the couch, laptop resting against her knees, eyes scanning through the day's reports. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, not just as a partner in life or in business, but as a force. She was more than capable. She was unstoppable, and he couldn't stay still. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled the laptop gently from her legs, setting it aside before cupping her face in both hands and kissing her, fiercely, deeply, with all the words he hadn't spoken in the boardroom or press hall. When he pulled away, breathless and reverent, he whispered into her skin, "You're not just a CEO, Emily. You're a legend." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the fire of a woman who knew her worth had never come from titles or love, but from the way she stood when others tried to kneel her. "And you," she whispered back, "are the only man who ever saw that before the world did." They stayed there for a long time, wrapped in each other, their bodies pressed together not out of need, but out of a knowing that no challenge, no attack, no whisper outside could pierce the fortress they had built between them. A fortress of clarity, of shared battles and bold love. The world would keep watching, keep questioning, but Emily would keep rising, and Brian would always be right beside her, not as her savior, but as her sword. The night after Brian whispered into Emily's skin that she was a legend, the quiet around them settled not as silence but as sanctuary, a calm that wrapped itself around their loft like a warm veil. Outside, the world continued to pulse. Markets rose and dipped, names trended and faded, but inside they existed in a rhythm all their own. Mornings came with sleepy kisses and the scent of French press coffee. Evenings unfolded with music, handwritten notes passed across dinner plates, and moments of unspeakable peace where nothing needed to be said because everything had already been given. Years passed, but not with noise, with depth. They didn't just evolve together, they grew into one another, like two trees whose roots had intertwined beneath the earth long before anyone ever saw their branches touching the sky. Emily's leadership revolutionized global industry norms, and Brian's once sharp edges now only surfaced in defense of the values they fought to protect. They led Caldwell Innovations with purpose, not power, with compassion, not performance. Together, they mentored new minds, funded brilliant ideas, and quietly changed lives in boardrooms, villages, and classrooms across continents. But even as the world marveled at their empire, the most sacred thing between them remained the life they had carved behind glass walls and candlelight. And it was on one such morning, one touched with sunlight so soft it looked like golden breath spilling across their oak floors, that everything changed again. Brian had risen early, as always, his focus locked on finalizing a global merger that would bring clean tech to underserved countries. He sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled, hair tousled, eyes narrowed, as he annotated a digital report with practiced efficiency. But just as he reached for his coffee, he noticed something small, a neatly folded piece of fabric lying at the center of his desk. At first, he thought it was one of her scarves, left behind absent-mindedly. But as he reached for it, fingers brushing the delicate cotton, he paused. It wasn't a scarf. It was a baby onesie. White. Simple. Software with a tiny embroidered star over the chest. His hands stilled, then trembled. He looked up, and there she was, Emily, leaning silently against the doorframe, one hand resting just below her navel, the other brushing a tear from her cheek as she watched him take it in. Brian blinked slowly, disbelieving. "Where?" he whispered, voice catching in his throat like the very word might shatter if he said it too loud. Emily nodded, and a soft laugh escaped her lips, joy pouring from her eyes faster than the tears she couldn't contain. "Yes," she said, walking toward him. "You're going to be a father." For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind, trained for crises and billion-dollar decisions, could not comprehend something so quietly earth-shattering. But his heart understood immediately. He stood, rounded the desk, and in one sweeping motion lifted her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the very miracle he'd never dared ask for. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face into the curve of his shoulder as he whispered over and over, "You gave me a company. You gave me a heart. And now, a family." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own glistening. "You're my whole world, Emily. Everything else is just noise." She placed her hand over his chest, feeling the steady thunder of his heartbeat, and nodded. "You're mine too," she whispered. "This baby, this life, it's ours." In the days that followed, their home became a symphony of quiet preparations and loud joy. The loft that had once echoed with strategy now rang with the sound of laughter, of books being opened to baby names, of drawers being filled with tiny socks and soft blankets. Emily, still as sharp and driven as ever, began managing meetings with her hand often resting on her belly, her tone unchanged, but her gaze softened. And Brian, who had once commanded global stages with steel in his spine, now found himself researching prenatal vitamins at 2 a.m. and installing crib frames on Saturday mornings like it was the most important job he'd ever had. They didn't tell the world right away, not because they were hiding it, but because some sacred things belong only to the hearts that birthed them. Their most important empire yet wasn't something for headlines or investor calls. It was growing silently, peacefully, within the woman who had once walked into his world with a mop and a mind that restructured everything. And every night before they slept, Brian would kiss her belly and whisper stories to the life forming there, about stars and strength, and how love once built an empire no one could tear down. Emily would watch him in those moments, eyes full, hands cradling his, and think to herself that no business title, no headline, no legacy could match the beauty of watching the man she loved transform into a father. And she was right, because in the story of their lives, this was the chapter where everything became clear, not just who they were or what they'd built, but why. Because every step they had taken, every challenge they had faced, had led to this single breathtaking truth, that love, when fearless and unbreakable, doesn't just create success, it creates life. As Emily sat near the window in their softly sunlit loft, her hand resting on the delicate curve of her stomach and Brian kneeling beside her, whispering dreams into the quiet life forming within her. They both knew, without needing to say it, that their story had taken on a new kind of magic, one not born from power or victory, but from the gentlest kind of transformation, becoming a family. And months later, when Emily's fingers gripped Brian's as their daughter entered the world on a rainy Tuesday morning, every triumph they had ever celebrated paled in comparison to the moment Brian first cradled that tiny, wriggling miracle against his chest. They named her Zara, a name that shimmered with strength, with meaning, with legacy, and from the moment she opened her eyes, it felt as if the world itself had tilted slightly in their favor, as if everything they had built had been quietly leading them to her. Zara's presence lit up their lives with a light so honest and untamed that even the sharpest boardroom decisions felt dull next to her first laugh. Emily, ever the architect of balance, navigated the early days of motherhood with a grace so grounded that it stunned even her most critical peers. Mornings were filled with coos and milk-stained kisses, afternoons with data reviews and policy meetings where Zara often slept quietly in a sling on her mother's chest, while global directors presented billion-dollar briefs. Emily led not by separating her roles, but by blending them, proving without apology that brilliance and nurture could coexist in the same breath. And Brian, once the ice-sculpted CEO feared for his perfectionism, softened into the kind of father who built entire bedtime routines like blueprints. First a bath, then fairy tales, then lullabies whispered in between recitations of binary code and bedtime philosophies. He read stories with character voices, sometimes pausing mid-sentence to brush Zara's curls from her forehead or kiss her tiny fingers like they were made of glass. And when she fell asleep wrapped in his arms, his eyes would meet Emily's across the room, and they would smile with a fullness that no investor report or media accolade had ever given them. Caldwell Innovations, meanwhile, didn't just maintain its strength. It evolved into a beacon of innovation across industries. Under Emily and Brian's shared leadership, the company embraced holistic tech, sustainability, global mentorship initiatives, and parent-friendly work cultures that broke traditional molds. Yet no matter how large the brand grew, no matter how many continents displayed their tech, or how many leaders sought their counsel, the heart of it all remained shockingly simple: love. Not strategy, not revenue, not legacy. Love. Pure, intentional, audacious love that once transformed a janitor into a CEO and a broken executive into a man reborn. Reporters often tried to pin down their secret. They asked about algorithms, about talent acquisition, about corporate structure. But the truth always slipped between the cracks of their clever questions. Emily would simply smile, holding Zara's hand during interviews, and say, "Love built this company, not money. Love made every system smarter, every decision braver, every sacrifice worthwhile. And Brian, standing beside them with pride painted across every inch of his once guarded face, would always nod with quiet conviction and add, "Your love rebuilt me, Emily. Without it, there would be no company, no future, no me." In their home, framed photographs told stories more powerful than press releases. Emily asleep on the couch with Zara sprawled across her chest and documents half read beside them. Brian and Zara in matching aprons making pancake batter disasters on Sunday mornings. Family dance nights under dim fairy lights where laughter echoed louder than music. Their walls weren't adorned with degrees or titles, but with crayon doodles, sticky notes full of dreams, and calendar entries that read things like Zara's first step or family picnic, no meetings allowed. And still, through all the noise and accolades, Emily and Brian made time for each other. Date nights with phones turned off, long walks through city parks where they talked about the future, or sometimes about nothing at all. They fell deeper in love not through grand gestures, but in the quiet acts. The way he'd place a fresh cup of tea on her desk during long days. The way she'd fix his tie before a speech and whisper, "Go make them believe what I already know." The way they both instinctively reached for each other's hands when watching Zara sleep. Time passed gently but clearly, each year painting deeper hues into their love, turning infatuation into intimacy, passion into partnership, and power into purpose. Brian no longer chased success as validation, and Emily no longer walked into rooms needing to prove herself. They knew who they were, individually and together, and while the world saw them as an empire, they saw themselves as something much more intimate. A home. A home built not on titles or spreadsheets, but on whispered affirmations in the dark, on shared dreams written in the margins of old journals, on the belief that legacy wasn't about what you left behind, but what you built while you were still here. On Zara's 5th birthday, they hosted a garden celebration in the very place where Brian had once proposed to Emily, the rooftop that had witnessed their beginning. Friends, colleagues, family, and quiet admirers came together, but the spotlight never belonged to the guests or the grandeur. It belonged to the little girl with curls that danced in the wind and eyes that carried her mother's fire and her father's calm. As Brian lifted Zara into the air, her laughter mingling with wind chimes and string lights, Emily looked on with a heart so full it spilled from her eyes. She whispered softly, to no one in particular, "This is what fortune really means." And she was right, because in the end, the true wealth they carried wasn't the billion-dollar empire or the applause of boardrooms. It was the love that had survived cleaning closets, corporate wars, headlines, sabotage, and rebirth. The kind of love that raised a daughter named Zara in a home where bedtime stories were told not just in books, but in every choice her parents ever made. The rooftop garden where Zara's 5th birthday once echoed with children's laughter had since been transformed into something timeless, a place of peace, reflection, and honor. Over the years, it became not only a quiet haven for the Caldwell family, but also a symbol that echoed across generations of innovators, leaders, and dreamers who passed through the empire that Emily and Brian had built, not from blueprints and capital, but from love, resilience, and belief in the impossible. The world had changed around them. Technology evolved, markets shifted, the skyline reshaped itself with new ambitions. But one thing remained unshaken: the presence of Emily Caldwell, now a global icon, and Brian Caldwell, the man once known for his cold calculations and now remembered for the warmth in his legacy. On the evening of Caldwell Innovation's 25th anniversary, the city turned its eyes once again to the glass towers where it all began. Guests filled the gala hall, dignitaries, scholars, visionaries, and friends. Yet all eyes gravitated to the couple whose story had transcended headlines and become history. Emily stood tall in an elegant gown of midnight blue that shimmered softly under crystal chandeliers, her beauty untouched by time, her posture still queen-like but warmer than ever, while beside her, Brian, now silver-haired with a trimmed beard that suited his wisdom, watched the crowd with that same fierce protectiveness he once held for a fragile company, only now directed toward the woman who had given him not just purpose, but peace. As the night unfolded, guests offered tributes. Zara, now in her 20s, shared a speech that made half the room weep, and a final hush fell as the lights dimmed and the screen descended above the ballroom. The premiere of the much-anticipated documentary, From Janitor to Queen, the Emily Caldwell story, began with black and white footage of the original headquarters, dim lights, scattered papers, the whisper of failure. Then came her image, young Emily, mop in hand, eyes full of fire, narrated by the soft voice of Zara herself. The film unfolded like poetry, archival footage, interviews with colleagues who'd witnessed her rise, animation of her early breakthroughs, and candid moments between her and Brian that the public had never seen. There were shots of them laughing while coding, building the first Code of Compassion model, Brian introducing her at global summits, Zara asleep in Emily's arms during a board meeting, and handwritten journal entries digitally animated across the screen. One that read, "Love is the best invention I've ever helped design." When the final frame froze on an older Emily speaking to a crowd of young women with the line, "You don't have to come from power to become it," the entire room rose in a standing ovation. The applause was thunderous, heartfelt, endless. But amid the roaring crowd, there stood only two people in stillness. Brian reached for her hand, their fingers interlocking like they had so many years ago on the night she became his co-CEO. The decades hadn't dulled that grip. If anything, time had deepened it. He leaned in close, his voice low, meant only for her. "They still don't know the best part," he whispered, eyes not on the screen but on her. Emily turned, her smile serene and knowing. "What's that?" she asked gently, though her heart already fluttered from the weight of his gaze. And then he said it, not as an old man, not as a CEO, but as the boy he once had been before her, raw and ruined by ambition. "That I'd crash this whole system again, just to meet you one more time." Her breath hitched. For a moment there was no audience, no documentary, no company. Just him. Just her. And the love that had rewritten every code they'd ever known. She stepped closer, resting her head against his shoulder, blinking away the tears that neither success nor strength had ever managed to stop. "Then I'd find you again," she whispered, "even in ruins, even if I didn't know your name." And as the music swelled and the audience returned to mingling, the two of them stood hand in hand, gazing at the skyline that once separated them, but now reflected everything they had created. In the days that followed, the documentary sparked global conversations, not just about innovation, but about courage, second chances, and the audacity of love to turn overlooked lives into legacies. Young girls in rural towns watched it and dared to dream differently. Executives reviewed their company cultures. Educators redefined what leadership meant. But no one felt the shift more intimately than the woman who had once walked invisible down the same halls she now owned, and the man who once led through silence until her voice taught him how to speak again. At home, life remained quiet in the best way. Their loft, though updated, still carried the original creaks in the floor. Emily's chalkboard wall still held sketches of new ideas beside Zara's childhood drawings. Brian still brought her morning tea with a note. They still danced barefoot in the kitchen, and every night they lit a single candle on the windowsill, not for mood or decor, but as a promise to never let the world's noise drown out their love. Caldwell Innovations expanded into education, healthcare, and climate tech, led now in part by a new generation trained under Emily's doctrine of human-first advancement. Brian slowly stepped back from the limelight, finding joy in writing, mentoring, and watching Emily command rooms with the same fire she once held in shadows. And Emily, ever the queen, continued to lead not with dominance, but with dignity. Together they had built something more than an empire. They had built a philosophy, a living reminder that no matter your origin, the heart can lead farther than the mind ever dared. Years later, on their 50th anniversary, when the world referred to them as legends, Emily would often smile and say softly, "We were never building a company. We were just making a home." And Brian, forever devoted, would look at her as if she was still that brilliant spark in his glass office and say, "You've always been my favorite design." And in the end, long after the lights of the gala faded and the story became a page in textbooks, two names remained spoken with reverence, not for what they conquered, but for how they loved. Emily and Brian Caldwell, builders of a legacy not carved in stone or servers, but written in the breath between two souls who found each other and never let go.